What's up, everybody, and welcome to Pants' Guide to Everything Shadow Priest in Wrath of the Lich King. Now, there's going to be a lot to this video, so check the timestamps to see if there's anything specifically that you're looking for. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing up is talents. Now, what you have on the screen here is your standard talent setup for PvE Shadow Priest. I've used this spec in every single piece of content that has come out so far, whether that's Nax, Old War, or Trial of the Grand Crusader, and I would recommend it for pretty much every single fight. Now, there are going to be fights where you want to change up some of your talents, whether to reduce your threat or reduce mana costs, but for the non-meme fights, which really those kind of are, this is what you want to use pretty much 100% of the time. Now let's talk about glyphs. For your major glyphs, you almost always want to use Glyph of Mindflay and Glyph of Shadow. These are Shadow Priest's two best damage dealing glyphs, and unfortunately our third slot isn't really that good. The options for your third glyph will vary by fight, but you can pretty much always use a Glyph of Dispersion, Glyph of Mindseer, Glyph of Shadow Word Pain, or Glyph of Shadow Word Death, though I don't really recommend it because Shadow Word Death is not a part of our rotation anymore and really is rarely used, so the extra 10% damage really is meaningless. For minor glyphs, you always want Glyph of Shadow Fiend because he doesn't really die that much like he used to in TBC, but it can still happen on occasion, so you might as well get that free mana back. I also like Glyph of Fortitude because it's really nice if you have to buff somebody in combat that it doesn't cost a ton of mana. And then finally, I like to use Glyph of Levitate because it really sucks if you go to press Levitate and you don't have any light feathers. Next up, let's talk about stats. Now, the basic priority here is spell hit to 17% is the first thing you want to prioritize. After getting 17% hit, then your stat priority is going to be spell power, which is greater than haste, which is greater than or equal to crit, which is going to be greater than spirit. Now, the thing about stat weights is that the amount you have of each stat is going to affect the relative stat weight of your stats. So if you have a ton of haste, but not a lot of crit, that's going to make crit incrementally better than haste until you get enough of it that they start to balance out again, and then haste will become more valuable. So never just take this at face value. You always want to be simming your gear. There is no static stat weight or EP value that you can use to just say, oh, this gear is better than this gear without simming it. Now let's talk about the sim. So there's a great website called WoW Sims that allows you to sim the DPS for any character that you have. You can use this for literally any class in the game for Wrath of the Lich King. Now the thing is, you can use it to compare all kinds of pieces to each other. You can try to figure out what is the best setup using all of the gear that is available to you. Now I have a link in the video description to this website as well as a basic profile that can help get you started. You should definitely familiarize yourself with this tool because it's extremely useful and has a ton of customization. All right, now let's talk about gear. I already told you the stats that you're looking for, but what combination of those stats? So really, you're gonna want anything that has haste, crit, and spell power on it, or if it's haste, spell power, spirit, or even crit, spell power, spirit. If you're looking for pieces that have hit on them, you generally want to go for hit, haste, and spell power. But there are great trinkets out there that obviously have hit and not a lot of other stats because they'll have some effect tied to it. Now I put up a BIS list for the current phase, but if you're new to the game, this isn't really going to be applicable to you. So if you just hit 80, what you want to be doing is try to get into some Old War 10-mans, try to do some of the hard modes there, try to get some of the sidereal or sidereal essences from the heroic beta modes that are, a little bit more difficult than your standard heroic dungeons, but you can get some really good loot from building up those essences. Some really good items that you can get from the essences are Petrified Ivy Sprig, Nebula Band, Asuga, Ice Core Staff, and Shimmering Seal. All right, now let's talk about gems. Now, the ones on your screen are going to be what you want to use for the different color combinations. But what about for socket bonuses? Do you always want to go for them? The answer is going to be, it kind of depends. With the release of epic gems, you almost always want to go for the socket bonus, but there are times when you don't want to. And essentially, that's going to be any time you have a single blue socket and a spell power buff of about 5 or less. Essentially, you'd rather put a red gem into this than a blue gem. But again, you should totally be simming the different options. Try it with one type of gem, try it with the other, and see what gets you the highest DPS. All right, now let's talk about professions for Shadow Priest. The number one profession is engineering. There is so much utility and damage tied to this. You get the hyperspeed accelerators on your gloves, you get rocket boots on your boots, and if you don't take tailoring, you will get a cloak enchant, though the tailoring enchant is better. You also get the ability to throw bombs, and I'll talk about this when we get to the rotation and the macro section. Now, tailoring just has the all-around strongest buff from any profession, but it's not always the case that you get that full value out of it. If you ever proc your cloak during an intermission, or just at the end of a phase, or if you don't happen to get it with your other cooldowns, it can be worse than what the math says it is. So it's something to keep in mind that you can get trolled by it, but it is mathematically the best option. All of the other professions pretty much have the same 46 spell power bonus, so if there's any one that you're going to take that's not tailoring or engineering, then you can just pick whichever one you like the best. All right, now let's talk about enchants. Now on the screen, I'm just going to put what the best enchant is per slot. Now this is going to assume that you have engineering and you have tailoring as your professions. If you don't, then it's going to change things because leatherworking gets a wrist enchant, enchanting gets ring enchants. So it's going to depend on your professions, but here is the setup if you have tailoring and engineering. Now let's talk about consumables. For your food buff, you're going to want anything that gives you spell power and stamina. For your flask, you're going to want Flask of the Frostworm. And for your potion, your pre-potion is going to be Potion of Wild Magic or Potion of Speed, and your in-combat potion is going to be Potion of Speed. As your gear gets better, Potion of Speed becomes better than Potion of Wild Magic for your pre-potion, but this is something you should sim for yourself to see what works best for you. All right, now let's talk about the Shadow Priest rotation. I do have a more in-depth video on this than what I'm going to go over here, so if you want to check that out, feel free to. But let's talk about the basics of playing Shadow Priest. Number one is that you have dot spells, which do damage over time. These are really good because you can cast these and then cast other spells, and while you're casting those other spells, your dots will continue to deal damage over time to your target. So our basic rotation looks like this. Maintain all of your dots, with priority being Vampiric Touch, Devouring Plague, and then Shadow Word Pain. After that, use Mind Blast on cooldown and fill the rest with Mind Flay. Now if you ever have to move, you want to first use Shadow Word Death and then follow that up with Devouring Plague. Shadow Word Death is no longer used on cooldown just because it does not scale as well as our other spells, but using it for movement is great. And we use Devouring Plague after that because Shadow Word Death has a cooldown, and with our talent Improved Devouring Plague, we get a lot of upfront damage from Devouring Plague, though not quite as much as Shadow Word Death. And when you have multiple targets, you're going to want to be applying Vampiric Touch to all of these targets, followed up with a Mind Steer in order to maximize your AoE damage. So this is known as multi-dotting when you're juggling dots on multiple targets. Now if you have too many targets to apply dots to, you may just want to Mind Steer. Generally, the limit is around 4 to 5 targets where you don't apply Vampiric Touch and you just Mind Sear. That's all you need to do to maximize your damage. Any more than that, and you absolutely want to just Mind Sear. Now, the important thing with dots is to make sure that the enemies live long enough to benefit from the dot. So if they're going to die in about 5 seconds, it's not worth applying a dot that's going to take 15 seconds for it to deal its full amount of damage. So in that case, you just want to use any spell you can to deal some quick damage, whether that's Mind Flay, Mind Blast, Shadow Word Death, or Devouring Plague for that instant damage. Now I want to give a quick overview of the different tier sets for Shadow Priest in Wrath of the Lich King. Now tier 7 is pretty much garbage, so if you're coming back to the game now, you have a new freshly leveled 80 Shadow Priest, just ignore this tier set. Don't try to get it from any dungeons or anything. The first one you'd want to focus on is tier 8. Tier 8 is actually really strong. Both the 2-piece and the 4-piece are really good and made Shadow Priest fairly competitive in the Ulduar raid tier. Now moving on to what we have right now in tier 9, the 2-piece is actually pretty good, but the 4-piece is very lackluster. Now, most realistic BIS sets actually have a combination of 2 pieces of tier 8 as well as 2 pieces of tier 9. Now, item level 232 tier 9 is just worse than 232 item level tier 8, so you should never use that. The only way you should go 2-piece is if you use 2 pieces of 245 item level tier 9 or higher. Since the 4-piece from tier 9 is really bad, you only use it in an absolute BIS setup when you have 4 pieces of 258 tier 9 from the regalias that you get at the end of 25-man heroic Trial of the Grand Crusader. Shadow Priest is extremely low priority on these tokens, so it's very unlikely that you'll get this before the end of the phase, so I would really just try to focus on a 2-piece setup for this phase as a realistic setup. Now tier 10 is going to be awesome. The 2-piece bonus is nothing to write home about, but the 4-piece bonus is insanely strong. I think at its lowest item level, it's about a 1200 DPS upgrade when we get the 4-piece, and at the highest item level of tier, it can be anywhere from a 15 to an 1800 DPS upgrade, maybe even higher as the sims are still trying to figure it out. But it is incredibly powerful and is going to make Shadow Priest one of the most competitive single target DPS in ICC. Now let's talk about add-ons. My favorite add-ons for Shadow Priest include Plater, which is an awesome nameplate add-on to track your dots on your targets as well as any debuffs they might have. LVUI, which is pretty much just a do-it-all add-on. This controls my action bars and pretty much the entire just organization on my screen. I use Quartz as my cast bar, and this is because I can track my Mind Flay ticks. It's extremely important that you never clip a Mind Flay too early. You might want to clip it to do a 2-tick Mind Flay sometimes, but you never want to clip it just before a tick is about to happen because that's going to lose you a lot of damage over the course of a fight. You only want to cancel it after that tick has happened, or you want to cast a spell immediately following the 3rd tick of damage. And having a cast bar that tracks your Mind Flay ticks makes this a lot easier to do. And then of course, Weakauras. There are so many great Weakauras, and I'll have a few in the video description of what I recommend to get started, but you can customize your entire UI around having really amazing Weakauras that pretty much tell you everything you need to know. Not just even about playing Shadow Priest, but about encounters or what your enemy might be doing. Now let's talk about macros. I also have a video going in depth on macros, so feel free to check that out if you want a more in-depth version than what I'm going to present here. But on the screen, I'm going to show you some of my favorite macros, and you can also find them in the video description, so feel free to take them for yourself. Now, the most important macro that I would suggest to pick up would be a Dispersion Cancel Aura. Sometimes you don't always want it to last the full length, so you want to be able to cancel it early, but you should not put this Cancel Aura macro onto the Dispersion cast itself. It's very easy to double tap that button and cancel it when you did not mean to, so just be careful about which button that you put it onto. And if you're interested in hearing about a no channeling Mind Flay macro, then definitely check out my other video where I go into detail about why this may be good or bad for you just depending on how you play the game and what your latency might be, because that really does affect it. Now, when it comes to races as a Shadow Priest, the absolute best one to pick if your horde is going to be Troll. Now, Troll is just the best overall, but obviously if you're Alliance, you cannot be a Troll. So I would recommend you go Troll if you're trying to maximize your DPS just overall, as Berserking is an extremely strong cooldown. If you're Alliance, then you have your choice between Human or Draenei, and I would highly recommend Draenei, as the 1% hit to have is really nice. Now, if you have a Draenei in your group, then you will get the 1% hit from the racial bonus anyway, but Human really only maxes out at around 20 DPS better than Draenei, so I would prefer to have the consistency of always having that hit buff than only having it sometimes if you have a Draenei in your group. So that's something to think about when choosing your race. But if you want to play a Dwarf or Undead, go for it. Just know that you're going to be missing out on a little bit of damage that you could get by playing another race. And that's all I have for you. Now, if you did enjoy this content, please give me a like and subscribe, as it helps me grow the channel, and I really appreciate all the support that I can get from you beautiful people. Now, if there is anything that I didn't quite cover in this video, I have other videos that go a lot more in depth into different topics, or you can leave a comment here or message me on Discord and I'll be happy to help you out. Anyway, that's all for this video. My name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.